Hi listeners of the Timur Podcast. As you can hear, I'm not James. My name is David Cott and I'm the host of the History of Spain podcast, a bi-weekly podcast that I started to talk about the history of my motherland. You may wonder, why is this guy talking about Spain, a country that's so far from Central Asia? But what's funny is that there was a weird and very interesting episode that connected the history of the Timurid Empire and the Crown of Castile, the main political entity of Spain. King Enrique III of Castile sent the ambassador Ruiz González de Clavijo to travel to the court of Timur with the intention to seal an alliance against the Ottoman Turks. This ambassador left us a fantastic written account about his journey, the Embajada a Tamorlán. And I don't want you to spoil you anything because James may want to cover this strange diplomatic episode in the future. But Timur ended up giving the name of Madrid to a town near Samarkand. Anyway, if you would like to hear the history of Spain in a chronological order, please subscribe to the History of Spain podcast and consider supporting it on Patreon. Now, I leave it to you, James.
Hello and welcome to the Timur Podcast, a podcast that covers the life, conquests, and character of the infamous 14th century warlord Timur or Tamerlane. For roughly 35 years or so, Timur marched his vast armies all across Asia, building for himself an empire that stretched from what is today central Turkey to India, from the Persian Gulf to southern Russia. And we are here to hear this story. But the wars and sackings of cities under the Timurid banners of war are actually quite a ways off. Timur is not yet the mighty Emir history remembers him as. No, where we left off in the narrative, Timur wasn't even the leader of his own tribe, the Barlas tribe. Last episode I mentioned leaders like Alexander the Great or Attila the Hun, incredible conquerors to be sure, but both of them inherited massive amounts of power and influence and even armies. Now, I'm not starting a petition to rename Alexander the Great to Alexander the Mediocre. Alexander did incredible things, okay? Don't let the Hellenistic Age podcast know that I'm saying this. Well, actually, sure, let him know. I'm not saying anything against Alexander. All I'm saying is that his life and rise to power would have been significantly more difficult had he been born to, say, a captain in the Macedonian army rather than the king of Macedonia himself. But Timur doesn't get this gift. Timur is a member of a somewhat influential family in a powerful tribe, sure, but he's not the leader of the tribe. He's not the son of the leader of the tribe. He's not the son of a Khan. He's not the descendant of the prophet. His grandfather wasn't some disenfranchised emir. He wasn't the owner of vast flocks or cities. He wasn't a nobody. But had the arrows that gave Timur his lameness actually killed him, you and I would never have known that this man existed. At best, maybe he would be a footnote in some long-forgotten, dusty historical record. And that's where we are now. Timur has a bit of power and influence, a few personal followers, but he's a far way off from becoming Timur, the great Emir, heir of Genghis Khan, sword of Islam. To become this, first, he needs to gather a following of men who follow him, not his tribe, not some Khan, but Timur. And at the moment, where we left off last episode, Timur actually does have this, or at least he has the beginnings of a solid core of followers behind him. But next, Timur has to become ruler of his own tribe. Then after this, he needs to become the leader of other tribes. Then he needs to eliminate any powerful rivals. Then he needs to unite Transoxiana, and then from there, he has to conquer. All this to say, Timur has quite a lot of work to do. Now, if you'll remember way back to episode 1, you might remember that I poked fun at some of those listicle websites that have lists like, here are the top 10 craziest things Timur ever did, or things like that. I bring this up for two reasons. First of all, with many of these short biographies on Timur, whether they be listicle sites, YouTube videos, or whatnot, you'll often hear from them this incredible fact that Timur never lost a battle. Timur is one of the very few commanders in history to have never lost a conflict, and there aren't a lot of these guys on the list. In fact, if you're ever bored, look up the list of military commanders who never lost a battle. You'll find some interesting stuff and some great stories. But anyway, yeah, Timur often shows up on these lists. And this is odd, because read any primary account of Timur's life, be them anti-Timur, pro-Timur, or somewhere in the middle, and you will find that Timur does in fact lose battles. He actually loses several battles. He gets defeated, cast down, betrayed, injured, routed, and even imprisoned. Timur's story is not some easy leap to the top of the ladder. It is a story of falling face down into the sand of the steppe. Now, it is arguably true that once he was Emir, Timur never lost a battle, so I can see how people justify putting him on these lists, but before he reaches that stage, we're gonna see him defeated a few times. Now, the second reason I bring up those short pop culture biographies of Timur is that they very often jump directly to when Timur becomes the ruler of his empire without explaining in detail just how he got there. And this I totally understand and even sympathize with. The story of how Timur gets there is long and confusing, and my cat is eating my houseplants. Well, the plants have been saved, but nothing breaks immersion like a cat. Jeez. Okay, so the story of Timur getting to power is long, it's complicated, and it probably isn't quite as important as telling about Timur's empire building. And his rise to power is just a flat-out mess. No primary source that we have really agrees completely with any other, and every named character is called something slightly different in every other source, and it can all be quite overwhelming. So, quite often you'll read summaries like, Timur manipulated and maneuvered through the politics of the tribal system he was born into, which eventually gave him the opportunity to take command. This isn't false, but that one sentence sums up at least 20 years of politics, and possibly more. But today, we begin this journey into those complicated politics. We kind of began it last week, actually, seeing how the regional politics began to shape the stage on which Timur would emerge, and we also talked more about Timur as a young man, aspects of who he was, and how he cultivated a personal following of friends, adventurers, mercenaries, maybe criminals, but guys who were in it behind him. And finally, we finished the episode with the political chaos that was about to begin a new chapter in history. Emir Kazagan, ruler of Transoxiana, had been murdered. His son, Mirza Abdallah, took his father's place, but wanted to extend his authority more firmly over the tribes in the north. And either because the northern tribes resented this, or because of Abdallah's sinful actions of murdering the puppet Khan in order to get the puppet Khan's wife, or maybe for both reasons, Abdallah was run out of town. He fled back to the south, but died soon thereafter, which meant that there was now no ruler of Transoxiana, but now only this fabric of tribes. But of course, Transoxiana, or Mawarnar, whichever name you prefer, this region was itself a part of a much larger political scene, because it had only been a few years earlier when this part had been part of the mighty Chagatai Khanate. This had changed in the 1340s when the Khanate collapsed and split, but that didn't mean the legacy of the Khanate was gone, because while this political storm was underway in Transoxiana, to the east in the land of Mogulistan, Khan Tughlaq Timur of the Mughals was watching with anticipation. After all, in his eyes, or at least in the eyes of his followers, he, Tughlaq Timur, was the true heir of Chagatai Khan, who was the son of the mighty Genghis. And it was Tughlaq Timur Khan who deserved the whole land of the Khanate that had once been ruled by his ancestor Chagatai. And this meant that Transoxiana had to be broken by the whip of the Mughals. But in Transoxiana, the people don't even know the storm that's about to fall upon them. In fact, this is a time of celebration for many of them. No longer does any tribe have to answer the call of some emir. There is no leader. Bayan Saldas, the leader of the Saldas tribe, and Haji Beg, the leader of the Barlas tribe, two of the most powerful tribes in Transoxiana, and both of these men, being the main culprits in overthrowing the previous emir, Mirza Abdallah, both of these men were either content with their lot in life as leaders of a tribe, or were unable to seize any significant boost in power. History hates a political vacuum, and a complicated network of tribal leaders and rulers of cities had replaced any hope for the rule by a single man in Transoxiana. Now, at this point, I want to introduce a new character to you, and I'm pretty excited about this because we are finally at that point in this podcast where we're going to meet people who will be with us through several episodes. That hasn't really been the case thus far, but now we are there. And so, I want you to meet Amir Hussein. Now, we had a Hussein last episode. That was a different Hussein. Confusing, I know. Trust me, I know. But now, let's just focus on this new guy, Amir Hussein. Because he's somebody who will be with us for quite some time. He's going to be a pretty big character in the story of Timur. Now, this Hussein just so happened to be the grandson of Amir Kazagan, the ruler of Transoxiana who was murdered just a few years before. And Hussein's uncle was Mirza Abdallah, that man who had tried to spread his authority to the northern tribes before being run out and then dying. So as you might imagine, Hussein feels a bit robbed. His grandfather and uncle had ruled all of Transoxiana. Sure, maybe this was just a name, but hey, that's something, and something that Hussein didn't have. But this doesn't mean he's not powerful, because he is pretty powerful actually. After the death of his uncle, Hussein very quickly established himself as this sort of regional strongman, ruler, warlord type figure whose base of power was centered at the city of Kabul and then spreading to Balkh, both of which are in modern-day Afghanistan. So Hussein certainly has power and troops, as these cities were quite powerful, but he does not yet have the strength to take back what was his uncle's and his grandfather's. But keep Hussein in mind, because he's going to try, and he's going to become a pretty important player for us soon enough. But let's get back to what's happening on the grand scheme of things. No one man is now ruling Transoxiana, either in name or actual power. This region is now a loose confederation of cities, tribes, and then regional warlords as well, like Amir Hussein, who we were just talking about. In other words, what does this sound like? Well, it sounds like the perfect place for somebody to invade. In the spring of the year 1360, large clouds of dust could be seen kicked up in the east. The Moguls, behind their Khan Tughlaq Timur, were riding to war. And the people of Transoxiana, from the noblest of tribal leader to the lowliest peasant shepherd boy, were woefully unprepared to deal with this invasion. So what on earth do you do in this situation? Put yourself in the shoes of one of these tribal leaders in Transoxiana. You lead this tribe, but only barely, because at any time you could be replaced by one of the many other contenders for leader of your tribe. So every single decision you make has consequences. The people you lead are watching you constantly for any sign of weakness or folly. If you slip up, even once, you could very well be replaced. And now, out of the east, coming at you with immense speed, is an army of horsemen that you couldn't beat even if you did have the courage to fight them. So what on earth do you do? I can see about 3 options for you. Number 1, you can fight. You can gather what soldiers you have, those who aren't already fleeing. Maybe you can convince some of the tribe to fight alongside with you, but this is ultimately hopeless and you know it. This also brings a high risk of you being dethroned before you can even rally with your soldiers, because maybe one of your many other rivals has a better idea that won't inevitably lead to the death and destruction of your tribe. But even if you do stay leader of the tribe and do face the Moguls in battle, you're going to die. And then your tribe will be destroyed, your riches sacked, and your women thrown into slavery. So all in all, not a great option for you. And if you're hoping that, but wait, maybe we can organize a defensive confederation of many tribes. Maybe we can all band together to fight the invaders. I've got bad news for you. It's too late to do that. The Mogul scouts are already on the horizon. They're already here. And maybe there were some tribes that would have allied with you months ago before this actual invasion was here, but now they've already surrendered. You were completely alone. So that leads us to option number 2. You could submit to the invaders. Now, this may have a better survival chance than option number 1, but it still carries quite a lot of risk, because it's not like you're going to have this direct telephone line to the Khan. You're going to have to travel to him or wait until he reaches you. and in between him and you are a whole host of advancing Mogul warriors, and they might be more interested in loot and slaves than they are in honoring the Khan's commands or accepting your submission. So somehow you're going to need to appease them and live to tell about it. Then if you do manage this, if you actually get to the Khan, you better hope that he has pity on you and doesn't see the need to replace you. And that depends quite a bit on his personality, something you likely have no clue about. Still, I'd say that this option is probably better than option number 1. But finally, you do have a third option, and that is to flee. Battle is hopeless, submission is humiliating and maybe hopeless as well, so you travel as fast as you humanly can in the opposite direction, and you bring every cart, every animal, and every person of your tribe who is able or willing to travel with you. And maybe it will work. Maybe you'll be able to settle down far away in a safer area. After all, that's how your nomadic ancestors did it. Maybe you can make it work too, but that's hoping that the Khan doesn't catch you, and that's hoping that there's no coup among your own tribe because they see you as a coward, and this is also leaving your land, many of your belongings, and whole hosts of your people behind, the sick, the elderly, people unable to make such a journey or to flee from their homeland, you're leaving them. So looking at these 3 options, the situation just does not look good for you, okay? I'm going to be honest. Well, okay, let's go back and see what these tribes do in this situation in the spring of the year 1360. Now, no doubt there were some people who wanted to fight the invaders, but without any system of defensive alliance to kind of enlarge this defensive coalition, they didn't stand a chance. And by the time a lot of these people heard about the invaders, the Moguls were already in Transoxiana, and many of the easternmost tribes had already submitted. Maybe many of the tribes that may have allied with you, they're already gone. And so what we see happen is sort of an odd, but it actually makes sense now that we've broken it down, and that is, nobody takes up arms against the Mogul invaders. This invasion, other than some minor brawling I'm sure, had no decisive battle or heroic last stand. Tughlaq Timur Khan just sort of rode in. And most of the tribes, out of fear, out of personal protection, out of hope for political gain, whatever, most of the tribes and cities just flat out submit to the Moguls without any sort of fight. But there were some who chose to flee rather than to submit. Better to be free than have to bow to a Khan. And one of these groups was the Barlas tribe, led by the man Haji Beg. And Haji Beg decided that fleeing with most, or maybe some of his people, was the best option to preserve what he had. And it is here, my friend, that Tamerlane, or Timur, emerges into history without any contention. Because up until this point, we've talked about Timur, we've talked about his childhood and early life, but there was no one instance where all of our sources agree on even the basics of the event. But the flight of the Barlas tribe away from the invading Moguls is the first time where every single source we have agrees that Timur was here, and that he had a part to play in this story. Thus, you'll often see this event in 1360 as the first time which Timur emerges into confirmable history. We of course have accounts that claim he did specific things earlier in his life, but this is the first time everybody agrees on the basics of the story. So, where is Timur in all of this? Well, remember that Timur was a member of this Barlas tribe, and Haji Beg, the leader of the Barlas tribe, could very well have been Timur's own uncle. Different sources say different things. So, here we are. Timur's about 24 or 25 years old if we accept the year 1336 as kind of his traditional birth year. But let's go with it and say that he's 24 or 25, and he is here, fleeing with his tribe, fleeing with his uncle from the wrath of the Moguls. And this is where history changes. This is where Timur begins his first bid for power. After traveling with his uncle and with his tribe for a short while, Timur decides to turn back. Now, as I'm sure you've come to expect with literally any fact that I give you, there is some debate about him or how Timur did this. Of course there is. A couple of recent historians have suspected that Timur and his followers simply left without his uncle Haji Barlas knowing that they were abandoning him. But most of our pro-Timur primary sources take a very different approach. They say that Timur and his uncle met and discussed this option, with Haji Beg finally agreeing that Timur should leave and return to their homes. As for why this option was even considered, well, let's hear what Timur himself said to his uncle according to the Zafarnama. This is what Timur says to his uncle. As a kingdom without a leader resembles a body without a soul, I think it proper, since you desire to go to Horizon, that I should return to Kesh. And after I have given fresh encouragement to the inhabitants of that country, I should go there to throw myself at the feet of the great Khan and offer him my service. I will gain acquaintance with the princes and lords of his court, and lastly endeavor by all ways imaginable to divert the temper that threatens our country, by which means I will save from inevitable ruin the poor people whom God hath put under our care, on account of which he will one day require us. So the plan is for Timur to go back, submit to the Khan, and then beg the Khan to hold back from causing the Barlas people to suffer more. This is a very noble cause, and certainly could be why Timur turned back, but it is also important to know that it was in this year 1360 that Timur's father Taragai perished, so burying his father at their home in Kesh may also have been what motivated Timur to return. However, another theory that may align more with how we'll see Timur behave later is that Timur saw this as the perfect opportunity. A perfect opportunity to take his uncle's place as the leader of the Barlas tribe. So whether it was done secretly in the dark of night or with his uncle's knowledge and approval, Timur and his men left the fleeing people and set their gaze back to their homes near the city of Kesh, which was on the cusp of being overrun by the Mughals. But Timur makes it back to his home city of Kesh, the Green City, just as or barely before the first scouts of the Mughals arrived. And Timur was not here to defend against the horsemen, he had other plans entirely. The Zafarnama and Timur's autobiography tell us that 3 Mughal officers arrived with their men to find Timur waiting for them with open arms. He praised them, showered lavish gifts upon them, and presented a feast before them. And after this friendly encounter, these 3 officers escorted Timur further to the east, further behind the advancing Mughal lines, to finally be brought face to face with the great Mughal Khan, Tughlaq Timur. Now, like we saw last episode when Amir Khazagan spared Hussein's life, even though the latter had just been in rebellion against Khazagan, we see a similar thing happen here. On paper, Timur and Khan Tughlaq Timur were enemies. On paper, Timur had probably just abandoned his tribe and his uncle in order to throw his lot in with somebody else. And you can find several more modern historians who cry out against how much of a backstabbing, dishonorable man Timur was for doing this all, and that Khan Tughlaq Timur should have executed him there right on the spot. But that's not how the Mongols worked, and that's not how the Mughals worked. On the steppe, alliances changed all the time. They were in a constant fluid motion. Even among families, relationships were constantly changing. And as such, Tughlaq Timur was not looking for an obedient, always truthful, honest man to kneel before him. Such men did not rule these tribes. No, the Khan was looking for somebody who knew the Barlas people, who knew the land around Kesh, who was competent and who could get things done. And now the Khan found this man bowing before him. Thus, what we see is that Tughlaq Timur Khan praises Timur for his humility and then rewards him. Timur is made governor of the newly conquered city of Kesh, the city that Timur knew and loved. Timur was also proclaimed as leader of the Barlas people, those who had been left behind at Kesh, and also those who were now fleeing with Timur's uncle, Haji Barlas. Timur had played the politics and had taken a gamble. He had sided with the biggest power he could find, and it worked. Timur was now the leader of the Barlas tribe and servant to the Khan of the Mughals. Now, just how the Khan gave Timur these honors is up for some debate. Our pro-Timur primary sources tell a fun story. Remember those 3 Mughal officers who Timur had given gifts to? Well, it turns out this may have all been a trick made by Timur. Because as the story goes, when Timur is brought before the Khan, Timur laments the fact that he would have been able to give many more treasures and gifts to the Khan, but alas, 3 of the Khan's own officers had robbed Timur, and thus, in doing so, had ultimately robbed the Khan himself. And as the story continues to go, Tughlaq Timur was enraged by this and demanded that those 3 officers be brought before him to surrender the wealth that they had taken from Timur and were rightfully his. These 3 guys, though, they were infuriated that they had been tricked, refused to give up the treasure, and organized a rebellion against the Khan, just like that. Again, diplomacy changes all the time. This new rebellion forces the Khan to divert his forces from conquering the rest of Transoxiana to now putting down this new rebellion of his own troops. Timur's autobiography takes this story a step further, of course, and we find the Khan asking Timur directly for strategic advice. Although whether or not that happened, I'll leave for you to decide. Now, this story is certainly fun, and it could be what happened, but there were also plenty of other reasons the Khan may have chosen Timur as the new governor of Kesh. First, like we discussed, Timur was a Barlas member. He knew the area of the city of Kesh, he knew the city, and he was competent. But further, Timur's sister, the Lady Turkan Aga, was married to a Mughal officer, so Timur had direct connection to some of the Mughal aristocracy. In addition, Timur's father Targai had been friends with another influential Mughal leader. Perhaps Timur and this Mughal officer had reconnected when Timur was burying his father. Finally, Timur's family may have even owned land in Mughalistan, although that is a bit harder to track down. But all this to say is that Timur was the obvious choice for the Khan to elect as the new leader of the conquered Barlas tribe. Thus, Timur returned to the city of Kesh as the new governor. He was given soldiers by the Khan, and then he enlisted additional soldiers for his new territory, and then immediately set to work securing his position. Because Timur knows what you and I know. The leadership of the Barlas clan, regardless of what the Khan decrees, the leadership of the tribe is contested. Timur's uncle, Haji Beg, is still out there in the west with a huge portion of the tribe, and of course a host of his own warriors and allies. At some point, these two will have to face each other, or somebody will have to submit. There will be a showdown between uncle and nephew. But for now, let's zoom out a bit and return to the politics of the Mughal invasion. And there's actually not too much more to say. The Mughal invasion of Transoxiana in the year 1360 was a total and complete success. Tughlaq Timur Khan, ruler of Mughalistan, was now the ruler of Transoxiana as well. The Chagatai Khanate, which had been non-existent for over a decade, was now reformed. But before the Khan could enjoy this new glory, trouble emerged. Back in his homeland, back in Mughalistan, a large-scale civil war had broken out. According to some sources, like we said, it was those 3 Mughal officers who had been tricked and humiliated by Timur who began this civil war, although we don't know for certain. Either way, the Khan gathered most of his forces and began the march back home, only weeks after conquering Transoxiana. Now, Transoxiana was still his, but he had to leave it for some time in order to crush this pesky rebellion back home. And so what does this mean? It means that Transoxiana is now without much of a central authority figure. A bit of a vacuum has been created, and everybody knows it. As soon as the Khan and his Mughals leave, the different tribes, emirs, and rivalries all burst into motion. The Khan is going to return, but in his absence, opportunity awaits. Timur takes this opportunity by immediately preparing for the return of his uncle, the rival leader of the Barlas clan. He strengthens the defenses of Kesh. He hires as many men into his following as he can, and it grows into a small army. But that's still not strength enough, because different alliances begin popping up all around him, and Timur also needs allies. And then luck finds Timur. Amir Hussein, ruler of Kabul and grandson of the once great Amir Khazagan, is looking for help. This is the guy who earlier I told you to remember, because now Amir Hussein is back, and he'll be back for a while. So Hussein, like most of the powerful men in this area, Hussein has an army, but he sends word out searching for more allies because he wants to attack Bayan Saldas, leader of the Saldas tribe, and Haji Beg, leader of the Barlas tribe. Hussein wants revenge on these men because they were the 2 guys who had overthrown his uncle, Amir Mirza Abdallah, years before. Well, this is actually great news for Timur. Hussein is one of the most powerful men in the region, and now he wants allies to fight Timur's uncle and his uncle's ally, Bayan Saldas. So Timur answers the call and allies with Amir Hussein. And this is not a seasonal alliance. No, this is something more substantial. Timur may have pledged himself to Hussein as a vassal. Different sources say different things, but what we do know is that Timur marries Hussein's sister, and this woman's name was the Princess Aljai. And while some of our sources don't even mention Aljai, unfortunately, some describe her at length, telling us that she was beautiful, a delight to be around, and again, according to some of our sources, Timur may have fell completely in love with her, maybe even refusing to take any other wives while she was alive. Whether this is true or later Timurid propaganda, the Princess Aljai will be with us for some time, and she also seals this alliance between Timur and Hussein. So now, Timur and Hussein are brothers-in-law as well as being allies, and speaking of this new alliance, Timur was not the only man who answered Hussein's call for help. The leader of the Yasauri tribe, another powerful tribe in Transoxiana, also joined. And the name of this man was Hidir, or Hesser. And it seems that Hidir and Timur had been getting along possibly as friends, and since their tribal lands were close to one another and they had similar enemies, they were natural allies. So now you have three parties in this alliance. Timur with his portion of the Barlas tribe, Amir Hussein, leader of the city of Kabul and the surrounding areas, and Hidir, leader of the Yasauri tribe. But there was a fourth part to this alliance as well. Well, sort of. The trio approached Bayezid Jaluyir, leader of the Jaluyir tribe, with an offer of this alliance to crush Bayan Saldas and Haji Beg. And Bayezid either did one of two things here. He either offered his sympathies and politely refused, or he agreed to the alliance and offered the idea that he should travel to the east, back to the court of the Khan Tughlaq Timur, to personally assure the Khan that these battles were being carried out by the Khan's subjects and on his behalf, and weren't a part of any sort of rebellion or larger scheme. Look, Mr. Khan, you don't need to worry about what's going on back in Transoxiana. We're taking care of it. Either way, Bayezid was not openly hostile to the alliance, but he and his tribe, the Jaluyir tribe, will show up again in a little bit, so remember that name. Now, I know this can get confusing with all these tribes and people and whatnot, so let's just recap really quick. The last emir of Transoxiana was overthrown by Bayan Saldas, leader of the Saldas tribe, and Haji Beg, leader of the Barlas tribe, who was also the uncle to Timur. Then Tughlaq Timur, Khan of the Moguls, invades from the east. Haji Beg flees, but Timur breaks away, submits to the invading Khan, and is, as a reward, made governor of Kesh and the official leader of the Barlas tribe, or at least whatever Barlas tribesmen are not with his uncle. Then the Khan leaves to go back home to crush a rebellion, as Khans often do. This opens Transoxiana back into a sort of power vacuum. Amir Hussein, nephew to the Emir of Transoxiana, who was ousted years before, he wants revenge and he wants to enlarge his Afghan kingdom. So he allies with Timur and Timur's portion of the Barlas tribe, as well as Hidir, leader of the Yasauri tribe. Thus, this forms a three-man alliance. A fourth man, Bayezid Jaluyir, leader of the Jaluyir tribe, is invited to join the alliance but does not become as prominent a member as these other three men. Okay, so what happens next? Well, now that Amir Hussein has his strength built up, he marches his army along with Timur and Timur's forces and Hidir's forces to attack Bayan Saldas, the man who had kicked Hussein's uncle out years before. Bayan Saldas flees to Badakhshan, taking refuge with a local emir there, so Hussein simply follows and demands battle from both of them, and both Bayan Saldas and this emir flee without a fight, leaving Hussein to take the spoils and land and people that were left behind. This was a victory for the alliance, a victory without actually a battle. So Hussein showers Timur and Hidir with gifts and praise, and then Timur and Hidir, with the campaign done, they began their march back home with their men. They reached Kesh, and Timur possibly held a feast for Hidir before seeing his friend continue on. Although this could have been an invention of later writers, either way, Timur was now home in Kesh and spent the next few months here building up the city, and we're told that the city flourished under his leadership. Then the Saldas tribe, apparently under new leadership, attacks Amir Hussein again. Hussein calls for Timur and Hidir, his allies, to come aid him in battle, and the two men again gather their forces and march south again to help their ally. When all three of these men gathered their forces together, the Saldas tribe saw how large the army was and fled without a fight or further aggression. Hussein once again showered his allies with gifts and praise, and Hidir and Timur once again start their journey home. As Hidir and Timur are returning home for a second time, Timur receives word that the thing he had been preparing for, yet probably dreading, was about to happen. His uncle Haji Beg was on his way home, and he had an army. And to make matters worse, Bayezid Jaluyir, that fourth guy who was supposed to be the fourth member of the alliance, well, he had joined forces with Haji Beg, which meant that the odds were tipped drastically against Timur and Timur's allies. Hussein was too far to the south and too busy with his new conquests to send help, so it was Timur and his ally Hidir against this new enemy coalition. As for this new enemy coalition, Bayezid Jalayir and Haji Beg then split up their forces. Bayezid consolidates his power in the nearby city of Samarkand, while Haji Beg marches his forces into the land of the Yasa-Uri tribe to defeat Hadir before moving on to Timur. Timur gets word that this was happening and rushes to join his ally Hadir in battle against his uncle, and so the two forces meet, and finally we have nephew against uncle. Haji Beg and his army of Barlas loyalists and mercenaries against Hadir and the Yasa-Uri tribe, allied with Timur and his Barlas contingent. According to the Zafarnama, the two forces meet at a place called Akiyar, and soon the situation descends into battle. This is what the Zafarnama says. They gave the signal for battle by the sound of kettle drums, and presently there was heard on all sides the cries of soldiers who were encouraged to smite their enemies. There was so great a dust that no one could see a person at 4 paces distance. And then it goes on. Blood flowed from all sides, and everyone gave the best proofs of his valor. Other than this, though, we know very little about this battle. Apparently, though, among the chaos, several of Haji Beg's key officers were killed, leading his army to rout amid this lack of clear leadership. And so Haji Beg is forced to escape with whatever troops he has, fleeing back to Samarkand to join up with his powerful ally, Bayezid Jalayir. And meanwhile, Hadir and Timur with their men are in hot pursuit, cutting down anybody who falls behind. And this is where something a bit strange happens. During this pursuit, most of Timur's army abandons him. And of course, our sources disagree on why this exactly happened, but most agree that it did in fact occur. Timur's army starts to melt away. Maybe most of these men were mercenaries and viewed the job as completed. Maybe his men viewed the inevitable upcoming battle against Bayezid Jalayir as hopeless. Or, as the Zafarnama and Timur's autobiography claim, Hadir grew jealous of Timur's success and so abandoned him, leaving Timur in a place of utter despair, aghast that his friend, and somebody he called his right arm, had abandoned him. I find this a bit odd. After all, Timur had just rushed to Hadir's aid. Why would Hadir betray him so immediately? But we just don't have too many other viable theories, so this very possibly could be how it happened. Timur might have been betrayed by a friend. However, with what we see next, I question how close this friendship actually was and think maybe that this is one of those very temporary step alliances rather than an alliance of friends set in stone. And on another side to this, some people think that what makes the most sense is that Timur and Hadir had actually been defeated rather than victorious in this battle. And maybe that's why we see them go different ways after the battle. But whatever happens, here is the result. Timur now has no army. He certainly had a few followers with him, his core of friends and guards fiercely loyal to him, but his army is gone, and his alliance with Hadir, if it does still exist, it is crumbling. And now Timur finds himself near the walls of Samarkand with few friends, no army, and facing the combined forces of Bayezid Jalayir and his uncle Haji Beg. You're Timur. What do you do in this situation? What can you do? It kind of brings us back to those 3 options we were talking about earlier: fight, submit, or flee. Well, Timur decides to submit. After everything he had done, submitting to the Khan, building up his own army, arranging important alliances, and helping those allies, ruling Kesh and his people for months, after all of this, Timur is defeated. Utterly defeated and humiliated, he has lost it all. Timur's first bid for power has been crushed. Someday, the city of Samarkand will be Timur's capital and pride and joy, but today, Timur is being led as a prisoner of war through the gates of the city to face the wrath of his uncle. But as we have seen, the politics of the steppe are in constant motion. Alliances and enemies can change overnight, and this is where one of those incredible moments of Timur's life takes place. When Timur is brought before Haji Beg and Bayezid Jalayir as a prisoner, a humiliated prisoner who's just been crushed, they welcome him as a long-lost friend. They release him from bondage, they shower him with gifts, and they restore him to some level of authority. Now, Of course, this is still a pretty big step down for Timur, obviously. He is no longer the leader of the Barlas tribe or governor of Kesh. Those roles have been restored to his uncle. But hey, it's better than being hung as a traitor, right? And if this drastic change is too much for you, then just hold on. Because now Bayezid Jalir and Haji Beg want to continue their fight against Hadir of the Yasauri tribe, Timur's former ally. And Timur joins them. Now, Timur may have been forced to join them in their fight against Hadir as some sort of you're free but still kind of our prisoner sort of deal, or Timur might have been eager to enact revenge on the friend who had just betrayed him, as one source tells us. But whatever the case, the political system we have just spent half this episode trying to understand has been flipped on its head. Historian Harold Lamb wrote a book about Timur, and the book has its problems, but Lamb does have this wonderful writing style, and when he describes this ever-changing alliance system, he writes this sentence that I just love. Lamb writes, "Had Machiavelli known these children of the steppe, he might well have written another book." And so this new alliance, along with Timur, marches out to face Hadir and the Yasauri tribe, Timur's former ally. The Zafarnama tells us that the two forces meet at a place called Surak, and describes the ensuing battle with this: "The soldiers mixed together with frightful cries, and the field of battle was in a moment red with their blood." And the result of the battle is a victory for Bayezid Jalir and Haji Beg. Hadir flees. And Bayezid Jalir and Haji Beg were now the two most powerful men in the heartland of Transoxiana. Before we wrap this episode up, there is one more little story that I wanted to throw in here. Like almost everything, of course, it may not have happened, but according to a few sources, Bayezid Jalir and Haji Beg may actually have tried to assassinate Timur at this point. As the story goes, they invite him to dinner, but when Timur enters the tent, he sees the shapes of weapons piled underneath a rug, or notice the host wearing armor under their garments. Either way, Timur fakes a nosebleed and asks to be excused, and as soon as he's out of the tent, he sprints away, jumps on his horse, manages to grab his bow and quiver, and takes flight as the guards chase him. But then, soon thereafter, according to the story, Timur returns again and submits to his uncle and Bayezid Jalir. According to one source, Timur did this because his uncle needed help fighting a warrior doctor, which sounds pretty badass, but I have no idea what it means. But whether or not this attempted assassination happened, here's what's important. Timur's first bid for power has utterly failed. It is now the beginning of 1361, and Timur is without leadership of his tribe. He has few allies he can trust. His brother-in-law, Amir Hussein, is far to the south and too busy to help, and Timur is servant once again to his uncle Haji Beg. And then, something happens. Can you hear it? The pounding of horses from the east. Thousands of horses. The Khan of Mogulistan, Tughlaq Timur, has crushed whatever rebellion stood against him, and now he is returning to Transoxiana with his army once again. But this invasion will not be like the first. The Khan has heard of these petty rivalries and wars that have taken place in his absence, and he is furious. This time he will not make the same mistakes he made with the first invasion. Tribal autonomy will be crushed. Only the power of the Khan will exist. It is the March of 1361. The Moguls are here again, and this time, they are here to stay. And that wraps it up for this episode of the Timur Podcast. Thank you for taking the time to listen and for your ongoing support. I apologize that it's been weeks since my last release, but hopefully with this, I always say this, I know I always say this, but I think soon after this, we will be back to somewhat of a regular schedule. Again, I don't know what that'll look like. It might be bi-weekly. It might be weekly if I can manage it. I want it to be weekly, but we'll just see if that happens. Either way, thank you for your patience and for your support. If you want to follow the show or reach out to me for any reason, the Timur Podcast can be found on Twitter at PodcastTimur, on Facebook at TimurPod, or you can email me at timurpodcast@gmail.com, or check out the show's website at timurpodcast.com. The intro you heard at the beginning of this episode is from David from the History of Spain podcast. A great show, one of my favorites. If you're interested in Spanish history, I highly suggest to go check that show out. And thank you, David, for just being so patient with me. I was supposed to get this episode out weeks ago, but thanks for just being totally understanding. And with that, next episode we will follow Timur as he makes his second bid for power. To find out whether or not it works, join me next time right here on the Timur Podcast.